The book of 1 Samuel tells the story of how David became king. The story revolves around three men, David, Saul, and the prophet Samuel. We know the situation. Joshua divided the land by tribe, but much of it still needed to be conquered. The judges could not complete that mission. And we're familiar with many of these cities, but there are always more, and a special focus on this region, near David's hometown of Bethlehem. The book opens up north with a woman named Hannah in the land of Ephraim. She prays for a son, and her prayer is answered. She dedicates the boy to serve the Lord in Shiloh. You remember Shiloh? That's where Joshua set up the tabernacle and the ark. The boy is Samuel. He serves under the high priest Eli, but Eli's sons are wicked, and Eli is told that his family will lose the office of high priest. As we'll see, the story of Israel's king cannot be told without the story of Israel's priesthood. God calls Samuel to be a prophet. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. At this time and throughout the entire book, Israel is at war with the Philistines, who are advancing north up the coast. Eli's sons bring the ark to the battle. They think it will guarantee victory, but instead the ark is captured, an unimaginable disaster. The Philistines have the ark, but they don't know what to do with it. It attacks their idols and their people. So the Philistines return the ark. Who can stand in the presence of the Holy One? And the Israelites take the ark to Kirjath-jearim, where it will rest for 20 years in the house of Abinadab. And when the ark was returned, gifts were sent along with it from these 5 cities, which gives you an idea of the area controlled by the Philistines, but we'll see that the border is fluid throughout this book. You know the pattern now. Israel repents from their sin and idolatry. Samuel the prophet becomes Samuel the judge. The Philistines attack again and are defeated, and they lose those 2 cities which we just mentioned, Gath and Ekron. Samuel judges Israel from these cities, and he lives here. His sons live there, but Samuel's sons, like Eli's sons, were corrupt. The Israelites demand a king. Samuel argues against it. He will take everything that's the best in the land. He'll take it for himself and leave you with nothing, but the people insist. Which brings us to a new character from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul, handsome and very tall. This is his hometown in Gibeah. He leaves it, though, looking for lost donkeys. Looking everywhere. Maybe Samuel can help. Saul was looking for donkeys, but he finds himself anointed Israel's first king. He is introduced to the nation at the same place that Samuel rallied Israel against the Philistines. Then Saul returns home. And that's when the Ammonites attack, threatening Jabesh Gilead. They threaten to mutilate the population. Saul rallies Israel. He will not let that happen. He defeats the invasion, and Samuel says, "Come, let us go to Gilgal to renew the kingdom there." This is the same city where Israel first entered the Promised Land, which is very poetic, but it might not be true. Looking over the details, commentators are not convinced that this Gilgal is the same as the Gilgal in Joshua 4, but they do have the same name. Anyway, it's a controversy. Now, back to the Philistines. And Saul's army is back in the south. His son Jonathan leads a daring attack. But if you're keeping score at home, the last time we saw Ekron and Gath, they were under Israelite control. But now the Philistines have pushed the border east. That's when Saul was fighting out across Jordan against the Ammonites. Now the Philistines push it even further. Saul is in Gilgal. He's waiting for Samuel. But when the prophet delays, the king offers sacrifice himself. This is a sin, and Saul is told that he will not remain as Israel's king. Still, Saul has work to do. He advances, coming in through the south. Saul and Jonathan encamped against the Philistines, who take this opportunity to move north. Something has to be done. Jonathan raids the Philistine camp, and in the confusion, Israel advances. The Philistines retreat. Jonathan is a hero, but he is in danger because of his father's rash vow. So Saul took the kingdom over Israel. and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against Ammon, against Edom, against the Philistines, and against the Amalekites. The Lord gives Samuel a message for Saul: attack the Amalekites. Saul gathers an army and routs the enemy and returns, but Saul has disobeyed God, God who delights in obedience, not sacrifices. So Samuel tells Saul that since he has rejected the command of the Lord has rejected him as ruler. And then Samuel returns home, and so does Saul. Later, Samuel is sent by the Lord to Bethlehem, to the home of Jesse, where he meets and anoints Jesse's youngest son, David. David cheers a troubled Saul with music. He is hired as an armor bearer. More clashes with the Philistines, and a new character, Goliath, mocks Israel. David slays the giant and becomes a national hero. The Philistines are pushed back again, and back in Gibeah, David and Saul's son Jonathan are friends. David and Saul's daughter Michal are married, but David is in danger. Saul is jealous. He throws a spear at his stepson. Michal has to help David escape out a window, and he flees to Samuel. Saul follows and is caught up in a prophetic state. Back home, Jonathan pleads with his father and then says goodbye to his friend. But David is not alone. He has a band of loyal soldiers with him. A priest allows them to eat the showbread, and he gives David the sword of Goliath. Now there are a couple different directions to go with this event, but let's think about geography. Let's remember Kirjath Jearim, the location of the ark. It was taken there from Shiloh. The ark was the center, the heart of the tabernacle, but there was other furniture there too. The lampstand, the altar of incense, the bronze laver, and, what David is interested in here, the table of showbread. So the rest of the tabernacle, it seems anyway, was taken to Nob. In the future, we'll see the dream of King David will be to unify worship at the house of the Lord, a temple in Jerusalem. Hey, why haven't we been talking about Jerusalem? Well, that's because David has not conquered it yet. It still belongs right now to the Jebusites. Back to our story. David can't stay with the priests of Nob, so where does he go? To Gath, which is back under Philistine control. Is he crazy? David moves. His numbers continue to grow. Conflict seems inevitable. So David sends his parents to Moab and then moves back into the wilderness. Meanwhile, Saul sends for the priests that helped David, and 85 of them are massacred. Only one priest escapes, and he flees to David. These men were from the same clan as Eli. As was prophesied earlier, God is transferring the office of high priest to another Levite family. Next, the Philistines advance again, and David frees a city. Still, he must escape from Saul. David's small elite army continues to grow. Saul hunts David. Jonathan reveals to his friend that David will be Israel's next king. David is betrayed and moves further south. Another Philistine invasion forces Saul to give up the chase. David moves. Saul returns from battling the Philistines. Now it might look like David is trapped, but he is the one who sneaks up on Saul in a cave. But David refuses to harm God's anointed king. And Saul has to admit that you are a better man than I am, David, for you have repaid me good for evil. Then Saul returns home. But, quote, David and his men went back to his stronghold. Call it Masada. Chapter 25 opens with the prophet Samuel dying and being buried in his hometown. And then David returns to the desert, or if we look back at chapter 22, maybe this is the stronghold. A reminder here that this mapping out is just one attempt to map out the text. It is not the mapping of the text. But in the desert, David is insulted by a wealthy man. David is about to take revenge when the man's wife, Abigail, intercedes. David and Abigail will later be married. Now I said David was, quote, insulted, but there is a fine line between expecting hospitality and committing extortion. David is then betrayed by people in a nearby town. Again, never trust anyone from Ziph. Saul pursues David again and again. David spares the king's life. Saul then returns back to Gibeah, and David's next move is to seek refuge with the Philistines. Again, see, everything is happening twice here. It's almost as if two complementary histories are being woven together, or you could think of this as stereo vision, everything happening at least twice. David here is given a city, but he is not settling down. David raids Amalekite towns, leaving no survivors. David then tells the Philistines that the plunder he is taking, that's from towns in Judah. This is violent and disturbing, but who's to blame? Is it David? Well, he's a fugitive, and at this point he has to worry about 2 wives and 600 men. How about Nabal? That's the name of the man who, quote, refused hospitality, but no one likes being threatened, and Nabal might have feared Saul. He must have feared Saul. He didn't want to end up like those priests at Nob. Saul, well, he's just protecting his throne. And we remember how Samuel warned the people against asking for a king. And then there was Joshua who never cleansed the land. Or you could just say, hey, it was a violent time and the Amalekites would do the same to the towns in Judah. Or you could say that what David is doing is really protecting those towns in Judah from other Philistine raids. But saying that it's a violent time doesn't really excuse or explain anything. Maybe what we're getting here is a picture not just of the danger of a mad king, and Saul at this point is a mad king, but also a picture of the need for a strong, for a just king who can rule in justice and bring about peace. Now, is that the type of king David will be? We will find out. First, the Philistines move north. At first, they want David to come along. Saul goes north also, and isn't this how the book began, with the Philistines attacking up north? Right now, though, Saul consults a witch at Endor. A battle is coming, but not all the Philistines trust David. They fear he still might be loyal to Saul, so he is sent back home. And when he arrives, David finds that the Amalekites have raided his home city and taken the citizens, including his 2 wives, hostage. So David rushes after them and rescues the hostages, and then he shares the loot. He spreads the loot around these towns in Judah. It's amazing what you can get away with when the Philistine army is up north fighting King Saul. And if you think about it, this is the type of thing that would make a future king popular. But we are looking back up north, and the battle goes poorly for Saul. Saul and Jonathan are pushed back to Mount Gilboa, where they die. And the Philistines take Saul's body and they hang it at Beth-shan. They are moving further east, closer to the Jordan River, closer to Jabesh Gilead. And this, remember, was the town that Saul rescued when he was first made king. Brave men from Jabesh retrieve Saul's body and mourn for him, fasting for 7 days. What will David do when he hears the news? That's what will begin the book of 2 Samuel. So, to review, after the judges, this area was under Israelite control, and Saul was able to do some unifying in the land. Raising an army will do that, but there are still major pressures from the Ammonites to the east, from the Amalekites to the southwest, and especially from the Philistines, who are attacking and splitting apart the kingdom. And then there's Jerusalem, in the center of it all, still under Jebusite control. David certainly has a lot of work ahead of him, and he will get to work. But over a decade on the run has already changed him. This boy who became a king and a man. But what kind of man is he? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands.